"I made a mistake, Brandon. I see that now," she added, her voice small and vulnerable. "It's not about fairness," Brandon replied, his words steady. "It's about moving forward. I've found a new direction for my life. I can't go backward." He discovered her betrayal when she slid the divorce papers across the oak table they had once chosen together, an unspoken confession of 6 months spent with another man. Yet, the end of his marriage did not mark the end of his story. Brandon Atkinson, the reserved grocery manager who had long sacrificed his own dreams for the sake of his family, stumbled upon a treasure that would alter his life in ways he never imagined. While his wife had exchanged stability for a fleeting illusion, Brandon chose reinvention. Armed with newfound wealth and a renewed sense of purpose, he rebuilt his life, thriving in ways no one, least of all her, could have foreseen. And then, without warning, he vanished. This remarkable tale became the centerpiece of a film, eventually earning the title of Best Picture, along with accolades for Best CGI. But before delving into the twists and turns of this compelling narrative, let me know where you're reading from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. The kitchen felt unusually quiet on that Saturday morning. The warm Alabama sunlight filtered gently through the lace curtains, casting soft, intricate patterns on the table where Brandon Atkinson sat. It was the same oak table he and Riley had chosen together more than 2 decades ago. A sturdy, enduring piece that had withstood countless family meals, late-night conversations, and occasional disagreements. Today, however, the table felt like a barrier, an unyielding divider between him and Riley, who sat across from him. Her hands were clasped around a manila envelope, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against its edge. Brandon glanced at her, noting how little she had changed in the 25 years of their marriage. Her light brown hair still shone, styled meticulously as though she had just come from the salon. She wore a simple yet flattering outfit, her athletic figure reflecting the jogging routine she had taken up in recent years. She appeared calm and composed, yet there was a subtle tension in the way her lips pressed together. For Brandon, the moment felt unreal. He had worked tirelessly managing the local grocery store, built a life with Riley, and raised their twin daughters, Alice and Rachel, now thriving at Columbia University. Their life together had never been glamorous, but it had been solid, or so he had thought. "Brandon," Riley spoke, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady but firm, the kind one might use when bracing for an unpleasant task. She slid the envelope toward him. "What's this?" he asked, his voice steady but low, a sense of dread beginning to settle in his chest. "Divorce papers," she replied, her tone flat, almost indifferent. "Don't need to give," Brandon whispered, the words hanging between them, ungraspable. For a moment, he didn't move. The words "petition for dissolution of marriage," printed in bold on the front of the envelope, felt alien, like a foreign language. His mind raced through memories. The day he first met Riley in high school, their modest wedding, the late nights spent soothing their daughters to sleep, the small but meaningful joys they had shared over the years. None of it seemed to make sense in light of this moment. Brandon leaned back in his chair, his eyes flicking from Riley to the envelope. "I don't understand," he said, his voice strained. "Why now? After everything? After all these years?" Riley let out a slow breath, her composure wavering for the briefest of moments. "It's not about you, Brandon. You've been a good husband, a great father." Brandon stared at the envelope, the weight of her words settling on him like a heavy fog. "But I found someone else," she continued, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was saying. The admission struck him like a physical blow. His jaw clenched, and his hands gripped the edge of the table instinctively. "Someone else?" he repeated, his voice barely audible, edged with disbelief. "Yes," she answered, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "His name is Derek Grant. He's a real estate developer. We've been seeing each other for 6 months." The room seemed to constrict around him as his chest tightened. The reality of her betrayal settled in, each word like a dagger driving deeper. The image of their life together, the house, the family photos lining the walls, the shared dreams, shattered like glass. "You're leaving me for him?" Brandon asked, his voice low, strained with the weight of the question. Riley hesitated, her resolve faltering just briefly. "It's not that simple," she replied, her tone softer now. "Derek, he's ambitious. He has this drive, this passion for life. I admire that about him. And I need more, Brandon. I need to feel alive again." Brandon shook his head, the words hitting him like a cold wave. "I turned down promotions. For you. For the girls. I stayed in this town because I thought it was what we wanted." "What you wanted? Was that a mistake?" Riley sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "It wasn't a mistake. You were perfect, Brandon. Too perfect. But sometimes perfection isn't enough." The silence that followed hung heavily in the air. Brandon looked down at the envelope, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He felt betrayed, blindsided, and above all, utterly powerless. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Riley replied gently. "The papers are straightforward. You'll keep the house, the cars, and all the money in our joint accounts. I don't want anything except a fresh start." Brandon looked up at her, his eyes searching for some explanation, something that might help him understand how they had reached this point. But Riley's expression remained unwavering, resolute in her decision. "Just sign the papers," she said, her voice firm but soft. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Brandon sat in silence for a long moment. The weight of the moment, of the life he had built, the sacrifices he had made, and the love he had poured into their marriage, all seemed to unravel in front of him. And yet in Riley's eyes, he saw no malice, only a quiet determination to move on. "I'll sign them," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But I need time to process this." Riley nodded, standing to gather her things. "Take all the time you need." As she walked out of the kitchen, Brandon remained seated at the table, staring at the envelope. The sunlight continued to filter through the curtains, casting long shadows on the walls. For the first time in years, the house felt unbearably empty. Brandon had first noticed Riley during his junior year of high school, standing under the bleachers at a football game. She was laughing with her friends, her light brown hair catching the stadium lights, and he couldn't look away. Back then, Riley was the kind of girl everyone noticed, confident, outgoing, and full of life. To his surprise, she noticed him too, the quiet kid who preferred reading about supply chains and market trends to throwing a football. Their first date had been at a small diner just outside their Alabama town, where Riley talked about her dreams of seeing the world, and Brandon, ever practical, shared his plans for building a stable life. Despite their differences, they fit together seamlessly, balancing each other out. Riley brought excitement into Brandon's life, while he grounded her, offering a sense of security she hadn't known she needed. By senior year, they were inseparable. They attended prom together, where Brandon nervously fumbled through a proposal to take their relationship further after graduation. Riley had laughed, telling him that he didn't need to overthink things. They had time, she said, but deep down, Riley already knew she wanted to build her life with him. Marriage came a few years later, followed by the arrival of their twin daughters, Alice and Rachel. Raising the girls became their shared purpose. Brandon took a job at the local grocery store, rising quickly to the position of manager. The hours were long, but he always came home to a warm dinner and Riley's bright smile. Their modest home, nestled in a quiet Alabama suburb, became their sanctuary, filled with laughter, school projects, and the sound of piano lessons gone awry. The girls grew up strong and ambitious, eventually leaving for Columbia University. Riley and Brandon cheered them on as they packed their bags, though the silence they left behind cast an unspoken tension over the house. Brandon often reflected on the choices he had made. Early in his career, there had been opportunities to relocate, take on corporate roles, or even run his own chain of stores. But each time, he had turned them down. "It's not worth uprooting the girls," he would say, convinced that keeping the family together was the right choice. He poured himself into providing for them, often working late and picking up extra shifts during the holidays. His dedication didn't end with work. He was the dad who stayed up late helping with science fair projects, who taught the girls how to ride their bikes, and who never missed a single parent-teacher conference. He took pride in his role as provider and protector, believing it was enough to keep their family strong. But for Riley, Brandon's steadfastness sometimes felt like stagnation. While she admired his loyalty and work ethic, she couldn't ignore the growing itch for something more. She had once imagined a life full of adventure, driven by ambition and daring choices. Instead, they had built a life defined by routine. Riley never doubted Brandon's love for her or the girls. He was everything a husband should be: faithful, respectful, dependable. But as the years passed, she felt as though she were living in the shadow of his sacrifices, her own dreams quietly set aside. When the girls left for college, the cracks in their marriage began to show. The shared focus on family that had once held them together now highlighted the growing gulf between them. Riley took up jogging and spent more time outside the house, searching for something to fill the void. Though she never voiced her feelings, Riley began to resent the life they had built, not for its comforts, but for the dreams she felt she had traded away. The clinking of Riley's spoon against her coffee cup was the only sound in the room. Brandon sat across from her, the divorce papers still resting on the table. He hadn't touched them yet, his hands tightly folded in front of him. "I think you owe me an explanation," Brandon said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. Riley hesitated, her eyes flicking to the papers before returning to his. "You're right," she admitted softly. "You deserve to know the truth." Brandon's chest tightened as he braced himself, though nothing could have prepared him for what came next. "I've been seeing someone else," Riley said quietly, the words slicing through the air like a blade. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Brandon blinked, struggling to breathe as the weight of her confession sank in. "Seeing someone?" he repeated, disbelief clear in his tone. "Yes," Riley continued, her voice growing firmer, as though forcing herself to speak through the discomfort. "His name is Derek Grant. He's a real estate developer." "And how long has this been going on?" Brandon asked, his voice low, barely controlled. 6 months, Riley admitted, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "It wasn't planned, Brandon. I didn't go looking for this. It just happened." Brandon let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "It just happened? That's what you're going with." Riley flinched, but held her ground. "I know it sounds awful. I'm not proud of what I've done. But Derek, he's different. He has this energy, this ambition. He makes me feel alive." Brandon's voice cut through the silence, sharp with anger. "Is that what you were going to say?" Riley nodded, her expression pained. "Yes, I know it's not fair to you, but I can't ignore how I feel anymore." Brandon leaned forward, his voice rising despite himself. "You can't ignore how you feel? What about me, Riley? What about the life we built? Does that mean nothing to you?" "Of course it means something," Riley said, her voice breaking. "You've been a wonderful husband, Brandon, truly. But I've changed. I need more than this." "So what's the plan?" Brandon asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "You ride off into the sunset with this Derek guy and leave me here with a stack of papers?" Riley straightened, her resolve hardening. "I'm moving in with him. He has a place overlooking the river. It's what I want." Brandon stared at her, the woman he had loved for over 2 decades, and for the first time, she felt like a stranger. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in around Brandon as Riley's words sank deeper into his mind. He couldn't believe it. The woman who had stood by his side through everything was now confessing to a betrayal he had never imagined. "Do you even hear yourself, Riley?" Brandon asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You're throwing away 25 years. For what? A man you've known for 6 months?" "It's not just about Derek," Riley said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's about me, about what I need." "And what about what I need?" Brandon shot back. "I gave up promotions, opportunities, everything because I thought we were in this together. Was I wrong?" Riley's face softened, guilt flickering in her eyes. "No, Brandon, you weren't wrong. You did everything right. That's what makes this so hard." "Hard for you," Brandon said bitterly. "You're not the one being blindsided. You've had 6 months to process this. 6 months to plan your escape. And now you want me to just accept it." "I'm not asking you to accept it," Riley said, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. "I'm asking you to let me go." Brandon stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. He paced the room, his hands running through his hair. "I can't believe this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "All these years, and this is how it ends?" Riley stood as well, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's not easy for me either, Brandon," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I hate that I'm hurting you, but staying in this marriage would hurt us both even more." Brandon stopped pacing and turned to face her. "You know what hurts the most?" he said, his voice quieter now, but no less pained. "It's not just that you cheated. It's that you didn't even try to talk to me first to fix this." "I didn't know how," Riley admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. "And maybe, deep down, I didn't want to." "I'm sorry, Brandon." The sincerity in her voice was undeniable, but it did little to ease the ache in Brandon's chest. He looked at her one last time, the woman he thought he knew, and felt the weight of her words settle like a stone. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Riley standing alone. The quiet click of the door closing behind him marked the end of an era, a marriage built on love and trust, now reduced to memories and a signed set of papers. Brandon sat at the kitchen table late into the night, the divorce papers finally signed and sealed. The room was eerily silent, but his thoughts were loud and chaotic. Despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him, he felt a faint, unfamiliar sense of clarity. The life he had known for 25 years was gone, but now he had a choice: to cling to what was lost or to start over. The next morning, Brandon woke up early, determined to take the first steps toward rebuilding his life. His first task was practical but symbolic: selling Riley's Subaru. She had left it behind, opting to move in with Derek and his luxury sedan. Brandon drove the car to the dealership where they had bought it years ago. It fetched a modest price, but that wasn't what mattered. Watching the dealer hand over the check felt like the first tangible sign of moving forward. Back home, he began the daunting process of clearing out the house. Riley's absence was glaring. Half-empty closets and barren bathroom counters served as daily reminders of what was no longer there. Brandon tackled the task systematically, filling bags with her leftover belongings and boxing up items for donation. The wedding photos, anniversary mementos, and other personal keepsakes posed the greatest challenge. While Brandon had been the one to admit it, it was always the keepsakes that had been most disruptive. After a long pause, he made a decision. He kept the family pictures that featured their daughters, but discarded anything that spoke solely of their marriage. As the days passed, the house gradually transformed from a shared space into something that felt entirely his own. With a clearer vision of the future, Brandon reached out to Max, an old friend and real estate agent. Max, ever the optimist, readily agreed to help sell the house quickly. "We'll price it right and make it attractive," Max promised during a brief phone call. The idea of leaving the house behind felt bittersweet, but Brandon knew it was necessary. Meanwhile, he tackled the financial logistics with equal determination. He opened new bank accounts, canceled all shared credit cards, and ensured Riley's name was removed from everything. He even contacted the phone company to disconnect her line and transfer full ownership of the account to himself. These small but significant actions reinforced his commitment to moving forward. A few weekends later, Brandon hosted a yard sale, clearing out years of accumulated belongings. The event was both cathartic and surreal. Neighbors stopped by, offering sympathy and casual small talk. By the end of the day, the driveway was empty, and the house felt lighter, stripped of its old baggage, both literal and metaphorical. With the yard sale earnings added to his growing accounts, Brandon began considering his next steps. A 3-month vacation, something he'd postponed for years, now seemed like the perfect opportunity to reflect and reset. One evening, Brandon sat on the couch, his phone resting heavily in his hand. The hardest part of all this wasn't signing the divorce papers or packing up the house. It was breaking the news to Alice and Rachel. After a long pause, he dialed Alice's number. "Hey, Dad," Alice's cheerful voice answered on the other end. "How's everything back home?" Brandon hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It's fine, honey, but I wanted to talk to you and Rachel about something important. Is everything okay?" Alice asked, her tone shifting to concern. "It's about your mom and me," Brandon began, keeping his voice steady. "We've decided to separate." A long silence followed, and Brandon could hear Alice's breathing on the other end. Finally, she spoke. "Separate? Like divorce?" "Yes," Brandon confirmed. "It's mutual. We've both agreed it's the best decision for us." "Does Rachel know?" Alice asked. "Not yet," Brandon admitted. "I was hoping you could help me break the news to her." "Sure," Alice said softly. "But Dad, are you okay?" "I will be," Brandon replied, trying to sound confident. "This doesn't change how much we love you girls. Your mom and I just grew apart." When Rachel joined the call, the conversation followed a similar pattern. Both daughters were initially shocked, but ultimately supportive. "Are you sure you're okay, Dad?" Rachel asked, echoing her sister's concern. "I am," he assured them, "and I'm proud of both of you. That won't ever change." Before they hung up, Alice added, "If you need anything, just call us, okay? We're here for you, Dad." Their words of support were a balm to Brandon's aching heart. As he set the phone down, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He hadn't just lost a marriage. He had gained a chance to rediscover himself. And his daughter's faith in him gave him the strength to begin. The air was crisp and cool as Brandon made his way up the uneven trail at Hayes Ridge, a sprawling 2,000-acre expanse of forest and hills managed by the local land trust. Armed with his GPS and a metal detector slung over his shoulder, he felt a rare sense of calm. Geocaching had always been his escape, a way to clear his mind and focus on the thrill of the hunt. Today's search was for one of the oldest survey markers in the area, rumored to be hidden deep in the forest. After nearly an hour of navigating dense underbrush and dodging patches of poison ivy, the soft beep of the metal detector cut through the stillness. Brandon crouched down, carefully brushing away layers of dirt and leaves, revealing a weathered brick monument embedded in the earth. A small bronze plaque confirmed it was the marker he had been searching for. A grin of satisfaction spread across his face as he snapped a quick photo, then began packing up to move on. Just as he stood, the metal detector emitted another faint signal. Curiosity piqued. Brandon retraced his steps and scanned the area again. The signal grew stronger a few feet from the marker. Kneeling once more, he dug carefully, his fingers brushing against something solid. After several minutes of work, he unearthed a small iron box, wrapped in oil-soaked canvas. The box was heavy, its surface rusted but still intact. Brandon's pulse quickened as he examined it. It didn't look like something modern. The craftsmanship suggested it was decades, if not centuries old. At home, Brandon set the box down on his kitchen table. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether to report the find to the land trust. But his curiosity got the best of him. Using a pair of bolt cutters, he snapped the lock and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled beneath layers of aged cloth, were 12 large cent coins, each gleaming as though untouched by time. Brandon's breath caught in his throat as he gently removed them. These weren't ordinary coins. They were immaculate. The intricate designs and inscriptions remained sharp and clear. For a moment, he simply stared at the coins, his mind racing. He didn't know much about large cents beyond what he had read in an old book his grandfather had left him. But even with his limited knowledge, he could tell this was no ordinary discovery. That evening, he retrieved the dusty book from his grandfather's collection, The Mysteries of the Penny. He hadn't opened it in years, but now he turned the pages with renewed interest, comparing the illustrations to the coins laid out before him. Each coin was a large cent, minted between 1793 and 1857. Their size and craftsmanship were distinct from modern pennies. Brandon used a magnifying glass to examine them closely, revealing incredible details, mint marks, flawless edges, and rare varieties he had only read about. One coin in particular caught his attention, a 1793 chain cent, the first official coin struck by the U.S. Mint. It was pristine, an almost impossible find in such condition. With growing awe, Brandon spent hours researching the coins online. Auction records and collector forums painted a clear picture. These coins were rare, and in their condition, they were worth an extraordinary amount of money. Estimates for similar coins range from tens of thousands to millions of dollars. "This can't be real," Brandon muttered to himself, double-checking his findings. But the evidence was undeniable. Each coin was a treasure in its own right, and together, they represented a life-changing windfall. The discovery sent a jolt of energy through him, replacing the numbness that had lingered after his divorce. For the first time in months, Brandon felt a spark of excitement about the future. He wasn't just holding a box of coins. He was holding the key to a new chapter in his life. Determined to protect his find, Brandon placed the coins in a secure container and began researching reputable dealers and auction houses. The quiet grocery store manager, who had spent years putting his family first, was now stepping into a world of rare collectibles and high-stakes negotiations. For the first time, the possibilities ahead felt limitless. The towering skyscrapers of New York City stretched endlessly into the sky as Brandon stepped into the sleek glass building housing Adams and Burns, one of the most prestigious auction houses in the country. Clutching his portfolio of photos and documentation, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. This was a world far removed from the grocery store aisles and the quiet Alabama suburbs he had known. A sharply dressed receptionist led him into a private office, where Leo Adams, the co-founder of the firm, greeted him with a warm handshake. "Mr. Atkinson, welcome to Adams and Burns. I hear you've brought us something extraordinary." "Thank you," Brandon replied, settling into a chair across from Leo. He carefully laid out high-resolution images of 4 coins from his collection, each meticulously labeled with its details. Leo studied the photos closely, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to clear admiration. "These are remarkable," he said, pointing to a particularly pristine 1793 chain cent. "The condition alone makes them rare, but this is museum quality." Brandon allowed himself a small smile. "I thought so too. That's why I'm here. I'd like to sell these 4 coins, but I have one condition." Leo raised an eyebrow. "And what might that be?" Brandon slid a letter across the table. "I'd like Adams and Burns to purchase a piece of land in Alabama and donate it to the local land trust. It's priced at $600,000. The proceeds from this sale should cover it." The room fell silent as Leo read through the letter, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "That's an unusual request." "I know," Brandon admitted, "but the land trust is doing something important, and this would secure their efforts for years to come. You'll get a tax benefit, and I'll know the land is safe." Leo leaned back in his chair, studying Brandon thoughtfully. "You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Atkinson, but it's a compelling pitch." After a brief pause, Leo nodded. "We'll proceed, on the condition that these coins meet our appraiser's standards." "They will," Brandon replied confidently. As they finalized the details, a new figure entered the room. Adelaide Langley, the firm's co-owner, extended a perfectly manicured hand to Brandon. Her presence was striking, confident, poised, and effortlessly elegant. "Mr. Atkinson," she said with a warm smile, "it's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard wonderful things about your collection." Her tone was friendly, but there was an undeniable air of authority in the way she spoke. Brandon shook her hand, surprised by how quickly she put him at ease. The next morning, Brandon was taken off guard when he received a call from Adelaide. "Mr. Atkinson," she said, her voice light, "would you have time to join me for coffee before your flight back to Alabama? There's something I'd like to discuss." Curious, he agreed. They met at a chic cafe near Central Park, where Adelaide got straight to the point. "I believe you're underestimating the significance of your coins. An offshore account might be the safest way to manage the proceeds." Brandon hesitated. "An offshore account? Isn't that complicated?" "Not at all," Adelaide assured him. "It's about security and discretion, especially with assets of this value. If you're interested, I'd be happy to guide you through the process. I'm headed to the Cayman Islands tomorrow for business, and I can arrange for you to join me." The offer took him by surprise, but there was something compelling about Adelaide's confidence. Before he knew it, he found himself boarding a first-class flight to the Caymans, seated beside her. The trip balanced business and pleasure. Adelaide's sharp wit and deep knowledge of finance made their meetings productive, while her lighthearted charm turned their meals into moments of genuine connection. Over fresh seafood and tropical cocktails, they exchanged stories of their lives. hers filled with high-stakes deals and international travel, his rooted in the simple joys of family and routine. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of her oceanfront condo, Adelaide turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You're different from the people I usually work with, Brandon," she said. "Most are all about the next big deal. But you're grounded." Brandon chuckled. Grounded sounds like a polite way of saying boring. She shook her head, smiling. "Not boring. Genuine. It's refreshing." For the first time in months, Brandon felt seen. Not as a grocery store manager or a divorced man starting over, but as someone with intrinsic value beyond his circumstances. Spencer had always been able to love his body, but it was Adelaide who made him feel like he could love himself, to love the value he held within. It wasn't just about money. It was about potential, about the realization that he was capable of more than he'd allowed himself to believe. But a few years later, Brandon fell ill. By the time he had recovered and returned to New York, the offshore account was up and running, and an unspoken bond had formed between him and Adelaide. As she walked him to his cab, she handed him a key. "For my spare room," she said casually. "If you ever decide to move to New York." Brandon watched her walk away, feeling a mix of both trepidation and exhilaration. The future was no longer just a blank slate. It had become a canvas waiting for him to leave his mark. Back in Alabama, Brandon sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, reviewing the final transaction documents from Adams and Burns. The sale of the 4 coins had gone smoothly, and the proceeds, now safely stored in his offshore account, represented a level of wealth that had once seemed unattainable. For years, his life had been defined by budgets, bills, and meticulous planning. But now, for the first time, he had financial freedom, a newfound sense of power. The discovery and sale of the coins had ignited something within him: ambition. For the first time in years, Brandon began to dream beyond the confines of his old life. He immersed himself in the world of coin collecting, scouring online forums and connecting with reputable dealers. His newfound passion blended seamlessly with an entrepreneurial spirit, sparking a drive he hadn't experienced in ages. Late into the night, he found himself scrolling through coin listings, researching their history and value. His growing financial stability allowed him to make decisions without hesitation. With Max's help, Brandon sold his Alabama home at a fair price, setting the wheels in motion for his move to New York. It wasn't so much a flight from his past as it was a leap towards something bigger. Each step he took built upon the last, strengthening his confidence. Brandon updated his wardrobe, replacing old flannel shirts with tailored ones and investing in professional attire. He began to see himself in a different light, not just as a grocery store manager, but as someone capable of navigating complex transactions, managing wealth, and shaping a future on his own terms. The change didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors who had once seen him as unremarkable began to comment on his transformation. He seemed more self-assured, even ambitious. While Brandon appreciated their compliments, he knew that this change was not for them. It was for him. Adelaide's influence lingered long after he left New York. Though their time together had been brief, her confidence and unapologetic pursuit of success had sparked something in him. She encouraged him without ever imposing her will, giving him the space to make his own decisions while gently guiding him forward. Her belief in his potential, sometimes more than he believed in himself, became a quiet but powerful force in his life. "Why settle for what's comfortable when you're capable of so much more?" she had asked him during one of their dinners in New York. The question stuck with him, echoing in his mind whenever self-doubt crept in. Adelaide's words continued to challenge him. "You're more resourceful than you realize, Brandon. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, convince you otherwise." With her encouragement in the back of his mind, Brandon leaned fully into his new chapter. He set clear goals for himself, something he had not done in years. He wanted to deepen his knowledge of coin collecting, take calculated risks, and explore the passions he had long neglected while focusing on his family. As Brandon prepared for his move to New York, the thought of leaving the familiar was daunting. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like growth. Packing up the last of his belongings, Brandon caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror. He no longer saw the man defined by loss or by what he had been, but the man he was becoming, someone ready to step boldly into a new chapter. There was something unmistakable in his posture, an unspoken self-assurance that had not been there before. Brandon smiled quietly, realizing that his transformation wasn't just about money or ambition. It was about stepping into the man he had always been meant to be. The cracks in Derek Grant's empire began to show just months after Riley moved in with him. Riverfront Development, once lauded for its ambitious real estate ventures, faced mounting delays and growing financial shortfalls. The grand apartment overlooking the river, the sleek BMW, and the exclusive social gatherings had all been funded by precarious loans and over-leveraged assets. At first, Riley remained blissfully unaware of the looming crisis. Derek, ever the charming and confident man, dismissed her concerns with promises of a quick turnaround. "It's just a cash flow issue," he'd say, brushing her questions aside with a wave and a smile. But the signs soon became harder to ignore. Contractors began pulling out of deals, and creditors started making their demands. Whispers of financial trouble began to seep into their once glamorous social circle. Riley's world began to unravel when Derek's creditors filed lawsuits, freezing his assets and leaving him cornered. One morning, she woke to find his belongings packed and a hastily written note left on the counter. "I need to step away for a bit. Don't worry, I'll figure this out." But Derek never returned. The reality of her situation hit Riley like a freight train. Stranded in a city where she had few friends and no financial security, Riley saw the life she had built with Derek disintegrate around her. The apartment, leased under Derek's name, was repossessed within weeks. Her parents, though sympathetic, could offer no more than advice she wasn't ready to hear. Her pride prevented her from reaching out to her daughters, who had already voiced their concerns about Derek. For the first time in years, Riley felt completely alone. The life she had envisioned when she left Brandon now seemed like a cruel joke. The stability she had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by an overwhelming uncertainty about her future. It was on a humid afternoon that Riley, with nowhere else to turn, found herself standing at Brandon's doorstep unannounced. He had just finished packing the last of his belongings, preparing for his move to New York. Seeing her there, clutching her purse, looking unusually unsure of herself, caught him off guard. "Riley," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "This is a surprise. Can I come in?" she asked hesitantly. Brandon nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The house, nearly empty, was a reflection of his impending departure. Boxes were stacked high, and the walls, bare and unadorned, seemed to echo with a quiet finality. Riley's eyes lingered on the space, her gaze tracing the changes. "You're leaving?" she asked. "I am," Brandon replied simply. "New York?" Riley nodded, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I heard about the coins. You've done well for yourself." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Why are you here, Riley?" She hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her purse. After a moment, she sighed. I need help, Brandon." There was the admission that Riley had likely struggled to make. Brandon crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, studying her. "Help with what?" he asked. "Derek's gone," she said, her voice a mixture of shame and quiet desperation. "He left me with nothing. I don't know where else to turn." Brandon took a long moment to observe her. The woman standing before him was a far cry from the confident, self-assured Riley he had once known. She looked tired, defeated, her facade of control shattered. Still, despite the pang of sympathy that tugged at him, he couldn't ignore the bitterness that lingered beneath the surface. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, his tone polite but distant. Riley looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "That's it? After everything we've been through, you're just gonna brush me off?" Brandon took a deep breath, carefully choosing his words. "Riley, I spent years putting your needs above mine. I sacrificed opportunities, all because I thought we were building something together. But you made it clear that wasn't enough for you. That's not fair," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I made a mistake, Brandon. I see that now," she added, her voice small and vulnerable. "It's not about fairness," Brandon replied, his words steady. "It's about moving forward. I found a new direction for my life." I can't go backward. Riley looked as though she might protest, but instead, she simply nodded, her shoulders sagging in resignation. I understand, she said softly. As Riley turned to leave, Brandon felt a twinge of guilt, but he also knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice. He had spent too many years living for others. This time, it was his turn to choose himself. The days leading up to Brandon's move were a blur of activity. The sale of his house had gone smoothly, thanks to Max's meticulous work, and the new owners were eager to take possession. With the proceeds now safely deposited in his account, Brandon focused on clearing out the last remnants of his life in Alabama. Boxes lined the walls of the nearly empty house, each carefully labeled and ready for the movers. Brandon found an unexpected satisfaction in the process. It felt as though he was shedding the weight of his past, making room for a fresh start. As he packed, Brandon came across an old photo album filled with images of Alice and Rachel growing up. Flipping through the pages, he smiled at the memories, but there was no sense of regret. He had given them a stable childhood, and now it was time to focus on himself. The weekend before his departure, Alice and Rachel surprised him with a visit. They brought their usual energy and warmth, immediately filling the house with life. "Dad, this is incredible," Alice exclaimed, surveying the organized chaos of packed boxes. "You're really doing it." "I am," Brandon replied with a small smile. Rachel hugged him tightly. "We're so proud of you," she said. "This can't have been easy." "It wasn't," Brandon admitted, "but it's the right move." They spent the day helping him wrap up a few last-minute tasks, sorting through some final items, and taking a walk around the neighborhood where they had grown up. As the sun began to set, they sat together on the front porch, sharing stories and laughter. "You've shown us what it means to keep moving forward," Alice said, her tone serious for once. "That's a lesson we won't forget." Brandon nodded, his chest swelling with pride. The fact that his daughters admired his resilience meant more to him than anything money could buy. That evening, Brandon's phone buzzed with a call from Adelaide. Her voice, as always, carried an effortless confidence. "Brandon, are you ready for the big move?" she asked. "Almost," he replied. "Just wrapping up a few things." "Good," Adelaide said. "I've arranged for the movers to drop your things off at my apartment. The spare room is ready, and I expect you to make yourself at home." Brandon chuckled. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Adelaide replied, a hint of playfulness in her tone. "You're starting a new chapter, and you'll have a front row seat to the greatest city in the world. What's not to love?" Though Brandon had initially been hesitant about accepting her offer, he now felt a sense of anticipation. Adelaide's invitation wasn't just about logistics. It symbolized the bond they had built and the potential for something deeper. As the movers loaded the last of his belongings, Brandon stood outside his Alabama home for the final time. The years of memories, both joyful and painful, felt like a chapter in a book that had reached its conclusion. By the time he boarded the flight to New York, Brandon wasn't just leaving behind a house. He was leaving behind the man he had been. The city waiting for him represented possibility, growth, and perhaps a chance at something entirely unexpected. When he landed, Adelaide was waiting for him at the terminal, her presence as reassuring as ever. As they walked together toward the bustling streets of Manhattan, Brandon felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. That evening, Brandon stood on the balcony of Adelaide's apartment, a glass of wine in hand, gazing out at the city lights that stretched endlessly before him. New York pulsed with energy, a stark contrast to the quiet suburbs of Alabama he had left behind. It was a city of ambition and reinvention, and for the first time in years, Brandon felt like he belonged. Reflecting on the past few months, he marveled at how far he had come. The heartbreak of Riley's betrayal had once seemed insurmountable, but now it felt like a distant memory. He had taken control of his life in ways he never thought possible, discovering a hidden treasure, making bold financial decisions, and walking away from a life that no longer served him. Brandon's journey had become a testament to personal reinvention. His painful divorce had forced him to confront the parts of himself he had neglected for years. For so long, his self-worth had been tethered to his ability to provide for others. sacrificing his own desires in the process. But now, for the first time, he was learning to put himself first, to embrace both the risks and rewards of forging a new path. His days in New York were an unfolding adventure, filled with opportunities for growth. Mornings were spent delving into the intricacies of the coin market and exploring auctions. Afternoons found him wandering through the city's museums and parks, losing himself in the energy of his new surroundings. And evenings were devoted to sharing stimulating conversations with Adelaide over dinner. Every day felt like a step closer to the man he had always been capable of becoming. The transformation Brandon was undergoing wasn't simply about changing his circumstances. It was about reclaiming his sense of identity and rediscovering the confidence that had been buried beneath years of routine and compromise. The painful chapter he had closed in Alabama no longer defined him. It had become the very foundation on which he was building something far stronger. As Brandon settled into his new life, the bond he shared with Adelaide deepened. What had begun as a professional connection had gradually evolved into something more significant, though neither of them had rushed to define it. Adelaide's effortless confidence and sharp intellect challenged Brandon in ways he had never experienced before, while his grounded nature seemed to offer her a sense of calm. One evening, as they sat together on her balcony, Adelaide turned to him with a thoughtful smile. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked, her tone curious. Brandon chuckled, swirling his wine glass. "Every day. But for once, I'm not rushing to figure it all out. I'm enjoying the ride." Her smile widened. "Good. You deserve that." Though Brandon remained cautious about the idea of starting a new relationship, he couldn't ignore the undeniable spark between them. Adelaide had become more than a mentor or friend. She was someone who saw him for who he truly was, not the man he used to be. Professionally, his move to New York had unlocked doors he hadn't even known existed. His growing expertise in coin collecting and auctions had already led to a few lucrative deals, and now he was seriously considering expanding his passion into a full-fledged business. The endless opportunities and connections the city offered made everything seem within reach. As the weeks turned into months, Brandon realized he was no longer merely surviving. He was thriving. The man who had once doubted his worth had found a new sense of purpose, driven by a blend of hard work, resilience, and the unexpected support of people like Adelaide and his daughters. For the first time in years, Brandon no longer viewed the future as a daunting unknown. It had become a canvas, waiting to be filled with the bold, vibrant strokes of a life well lived. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready to paint it,